Smoke was still rising from the ruins when Daniel Carter returned home, and standing across the street was the HOA president who had warned him just days earlier. But what no one on that quiet suburban block knew was that this fire would lead to a courtroom moment that would shock the entire neighborhood. Daniel Carter loved his home on Maple Grove Lane. It wasn't the biggest house in the neighborhood, but it carried years of memories. The porch where he drank coffee every morning. The oak tree he planted with his daughter. The quiet evenings that made the place feel like more than just a property. But the neighborhood also had a strict homeowners association, and its president, Karen Whitmore, believed rules were everything. Karen had recently begun targeting Daniel over small violations. A mailbox she claimed was the wrong color. Garden lights she said were too bright. Even the height of the grass near the sidewalk. Daniel tried to cooperate at first. He attended HOA meetings and calmly explained that most of the issues were minor misunderstandings. Karen disagreed. 3 days before the fire, she delivered another warning letter. This time it mentioned serious consequences if certain violations were not corrected immediately. Daniel thought it was just another HOA complaint. Then the night of the fire came. By morning, the house he loved had been reduced to blackened walls and twisted beams. Neighbors gathered quietly along the sidewalk as firefighters finished their work. Daniel stood there stunned. Across the street, Karen watched silently, but what would happen next would carry this story far beyond Maple Grove Lane. The fire investigation began almost immediately. Officials walked carefully around the damaged structure, examining every detail. Neighbors whispered among themselves, trying to understand how such a quiet street could experience something so devastating. Daniel stayed calm despite the shock. Friends offered support, and several neighbors helped him gather belongings that had survived. But one thing kept bothering him. The fire had started in a very unusual location near the back storage area where outdoor equipment was kept. Investigators asked questions about recent activity around the property. Had anyone been near the house recently? Had there been construction work? Visitors? Daniel paused before answering, because something suddenly came back to his mind. 2 evenings before the fire, he had seen Karen walking near his property line while speaking on the phone. At the time it seemed harmless, now it felt strange. Investigators made notes and continued examining the site. Meanwhile, Karen remained unusually quiet during the entire process. Normally she spoke confidently at neighborhood meetings. Now she avoided conversation and quickly returned to her house whenever people approached. The investigation would take time, but Daniel had a feeling the truth behind the fire was much more complicated than anyone realized, and the next discovery would push the story in a direction no one expected. 3 days later, investigators returned with new questions. This time they brought security footage from a nearby home. One of Daniel's neighbors had installed a driveway camera that captured activity along the street. The video showed several quiet nights, cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, normal suburban life. But one clip caught everyone's attention. Late in the evening before the fire, a familiar figure appeared near Daniel's property. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but the outline of the person was recognizable. It looked very much like Karen Whitmore. Investigators carefully reviewed the footage again. The figure seemed to move near the storage area behind the house before walking away. The video didn't show what happened next, but the timing raised serious questions. When Daniel saw the footage, he didn't react with anger. He simply felt confused. Why would the HOA president be walking near his backyard late at night? Investigators continued collecting evidence. Meanwhile, word quietly spread across the neighborhood. Residents began discussing the strange video. Some defended Karen, saying there must be an explanation. Others weren't so sure, and as the investigation moved forward, the next step would bring the situation directly into a courtroom. The courtroom was quieter than Daniel expected. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows as residents from Maple Grove Lane filled the seats. Everyone wanted to understand what had happened. Karen Whitmore sat at one table with her attorney, looking tense but determined. Daniel sat across the room with his legal team. The case wasn't about accusations alone, it was about understanding the events that led to the fire. Investigators presented their findings carefully. They explained the unusual origin point of the fire. They described the security footage showing someone near the property, and they shared additional evidence gathered during the investigation. The room grew still as each detail was explained. Karen's attorney argued that the video was unclear and did not prove intent. Daniel's lawyer responded calmly, focusing on the timeline and the unusual activity near the house. But the most important moment had not arrived yet, because investigators had one more piece of information to present, something that would connect the entire story together. And when the judge allowed the final evidence to be shown, the courtroom leaned forward in anticipation. The final evidence came from an unexpected source, a delivery driver who had passed through Maple Grove Lane the evening before the fire had recorded dash camera footage. The driver had not realized its importance until investigators contacted local residents asking about video recordings. When the footage was displayed in court, the room fell silent. The camera showed the street clearly as the delivery truck drove past Daniel's house, and for a brief moment, it captured Karen Whitmore. Standing near the side of the property holding a small container, the video did not show a fire, but it confirmed something important. Karen had been near the house at the exact time investigators believed the fire had started. Her attorney tried to challenge the interpretation, but the combined timeline of events made the situation increasingly difficult to explain. Daniel watched quietly as the footage ended. The courtroom waited, because the final decision would now rest with the judge, and the moment that followed would determine how this extraordinary neighborhood dispute would finally end. After reviewing the evidence, the judge called for a brief recess. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations. Residents of Maple Grove Lane tried to process everything they had heard. The story that began as a simple HOA dispute had turned into something far more serious. When the judge returned, the room became completely silent. He spoke carefully about the responsibility of evidence and the importance of fairness in every decision. The investigation had revealed unusual activity and concerning circumstances, but the final ruling would depend on the full legal process continuing through proper channels. For now, the court acknowledged the evidence connecting Karen to the property before the fire. The case would proceed further in the coming weeks. Karen sat quietly, no longer speaking confidently as she once had at HOA meetings. Daniel remained calm. For him, the most important thing was not revenge, it was understanding the truth about what had happened to his home, and the final chapter of the story would bring a surprising sense of closure to the entire neighborhood. Weeks later, Maple Grove Lane slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. Daniel began planning the rebuilding of his home. Neighbors offered help, tools, and encouragement. The tragedy had brought the community closer together. The legal process continued, but Daniel focused on moving forward. The empty lot where his house once stood would soon become a new beginning. Karen Whitmore eventually stepped down from her position as HOA president. The neighborhood board selected new leadership and promised to create clearer, more respectful communication with residents. The conflict that once divided the street had turned into an important lesson for everyone involved. Daniel often visited the property at sunset, imagining the future home that would stand there, and each time he looked around, he saw neighbors who had chosen kindness over conflict. Sometimes the most powerful endings don't come from arguments, they come from communities deciding to grow stronger together, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.